Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Rachel Volberg, and I am the principal investigator on the Massachusetts Gambling Impact Cohort, or MAGIC study. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar, which is focused on the preliminary results of the study. In thinking about the best way to wrap up the MAGIC study, we realized that presenting these preliminary results would provide an opportunity to get feedback from a wide range of people and organizations as we finalize the report. But before we start, I want to review some of the logistics for this event. Next slide. To begin with, the webinar is being recorded, and after the webinar, a link to the recording will be available on our SEIGMA website. Participants will be muted during the webinar, and we would appreciate it if everyone could also turn off their video so that we can ensure a stable platform. There will be a Q&A period following the presentation and the panel discussion. We'd appreciate it if you could type your questions into the chat box window, and we will post a document on our SEIGMA website soon after the webinar with answers to questions that we are not able to get to today. Next slide. So before we get going, I want to share with you one of my favorite illustrations from our very first report on MAGIC. Each star on this map represents one of the members of our cohort. And each member of that cohort made a critical contribution to the project. And I'd like to express my deep appreciation for their participation in the study. Next. Whenever a new wave of the study was launched, I received numerous emails from members of the cohort because my email was the one that was posted. Sometimes they were simply letting me know that they had completed that year's survey. Sometimes they had advice to offer about the questionnaire or wanted to clarify an answer they had provided to a specific question. I recently went back through the emails that I received from cohort members when the final wave of the study was launched in 2019, and was particularly struck by these two. The first is from a cohort member who was concerned that they might be too late to participate in that wave of the study. The second is more concerning, but also gives us insight into the challenges that some members of the cohort face on an ongoing basis. And just to clarify, all of the members of the cohort were offered an early bird incentive if they completed the online version of the questionnaire within 2 weeks of receiving the invitation to participate. And that's the $50 that that individual is referring to. Next. I want to start today's program by reviewing the agenda. Over the next few minutes, I will provide some background information about how the MAGIC study came about. We will then have a 45-minute presentation by Dr. Rob Williams, co-principal investigator of MAGIC. The presentation will highlight the main findings of the study and will identify what the research team sees as the main policy implications of those findings. At 10:55, we will move on to a 40-minute panel discussion with representatives from the Massachusetts Gaming Commission, the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, the Massachusetts Council on Gaming and Health, and Judith Glynn, the author of the Gaming Commission's Research Strategic Plan. At 11:35, we will pivot to answer some of the questions posted in the meeting's chat box. And finally, at 11:50, Kathy Judge Stein, chair of the Massachusetts Gaming Commission, will provide some closing remarks. Next. Next slide. As you may already know, in addition to authorizing casinos in Massachusetts, the Expanded Gaming Act of 2011 required the Gaming Commission to establish an annual research agenda with some specific components, which I have listed here. In March 2013, the Gaming Commission selected our research team based at the UMass Amherst School of Public Health and Health Sciences to carry out the first two elements of this broad research agenda included in the Expanded Gaming Act. The social and economic impacts of gambling in Massachusetts or SEIGMA study, included a comprehensive, first of its kind baseline survey of problem gambling prevalence that was completed well before any of the new casinos became operational. Since 2013, the SEIGMA research team has been collecting and analyzing a wide array of data from the baseline and targeted surveys, the casino operators, the Gaming Commission, and other sources to help understand the social and economic impacts of this gambling expansion. Next. While robust in many regards, the SEIGMA methodology provides population-based snapshots of the dynamic process of behavior change during a time of gambling expansion. The cross-sectional design of SEIGMA stands in contrast to a longitudinal cohort design that follows a group of people with shared experience, in this case, exposure to expanded gambling, at intervals over time. A cohort study provides etiological information about how problem gambling develops, progresses, and remits, which in turn has significant value for prevention and treatment. In November of 2013, before any of the casinos in Massachusetts had opened, the Gaming Commission issued a request for proposals to conduct a multi-year cohort study to provide insight into the causes of problem gambling and the variables influencing changes in gambling status. In April of 2014, the Gaming Commission selected our same UMass research team to conduct the cohort study. However, due to uncertainties associated with possible repeal of the Expanded Gaming Act, the Commission directed that the study not begin until after the results of a referendum had been determined in November of 2014. The Massachusetts Gambling Impact Cohort Study was officially launched in December of 2014. Next. There have been many prior longitudinal cohort studies of gambling and problem gambling. While these studies have yielded useful information, the large majority have one or more important deficits. These include assessment of only a small subset of etiologically relevant variables, a very circumscribed demographic, a very small sample size, or a very small number of people who became problem gamblers over the course of the study, a study of either gambling or problem gambling, but not both, and poor retention rates with differentially higher attrition for certain demographic groups and people who are heavy gamblers or problem gamblers. Partly in recognition of these limitations, 5 comprehensive large-scale longitudinal studies of gambling and problem gambling were undertaken in 4 different jurisdictions in the mid-2000s, and I've listed these here for you. Next slide. There have been some surprisingly consistent findings across these large-scale cohort studies. For example, all of the studies found that problem and at-risk gambling are surprisingly unstable entities. Across the studies, many different variables increase the risk of developing future problem gambling, rather than just 1 or 2 key variables. And while many variables predict future problem gambling, some factors are stronger predictors than others. However, predictors of the first onset of problem gambling tend to be gambling related, while non-gambling variables have a greater role in problem gambling continuation and relapse. Next. My last slide addresses some of the unique contributions that magic makes to our understanding of gambling and problem gambling. First of all, magic is the first major cohort study of gambling carried out in the United States. Second, the change in gambling availability in Massachusetts is much greater than in other jurisdictions where such studies have been carried out elsewhere. Magic was designed to address some of the limitations of those previous studies and build on their findings. And finally, magic is synergistic with SEIGMA, producing results that are richer than either study alone. And now I'm going to turn the floor over to Rob Williams to present the preliminary results from magic.
Thanks, Rachel, and good morning, everyone. Well, I suppose it's afternoon and evening for a few people. So yeah, let's just get right into it. Next slide, Martha. So introduce our research team. In addition to Rachel and myself, we have Martha Zorn, our data manager, Ed Stanek, who's now enjoying retirement, Valerie Evans, our biostatistician, and I should also mention our survey company, NORC, at the University of Chicago, who very skillfully administered the surveys in our cohort over the 6-year period. Next slide. As Rachel mentioned, it's the first cohort study for gambling in the United States, began in 2013, and has several advantages. That we had a bigger change in gambling availability with the introduction of casinos during the cohort, and so we're able to evaluate the impact of casinos. It's a different demographic, different prevention initiatives in place. It's a different time period, and Rachel and I have been involved in most of the prior longitudinal studies to some extent. So we utilized those findings to make sure that our assessment instrument captured all the variables of etiological significance in our questionnaire. Okay, next slide. 4 research goals. So it wasn't just to create an etiological model or look at predictors, but again, it's magic. And so part of it was to determine the impacts of these casinos. So monitor changes in level of gambling and problem gambling over time within the cohort that might identify impacts of the casino introduction. Second was to determine the stability and course of problem at risk and recreational gambling. The third and fourth more obvious ones, identify the predictors of problem gambling onset, continuation, remission, and relapse for the purposes of developing an etiological model. And then finally, to operationalize those results into some meaningful policies that help mitigate the harm associated with gambling. Next slide. A few details of the 5 waves. The initial wave in 2013 was actually intended to be a cross-sectional baseline general population survey. We had about 10,000 people surveyed. At that point, we didn't actually envision a cohort study. And it was only after that we received a contract to also do a cohort study. So we recruited people from our original baseline to be part of that. And so we had 3,000 people roughly who responded to the original baseline survey of 2013-14. And then 65% of those people agreed, of the ones we targeted for recruitment. We didn't target everyone. We overselected for people with characteristics at risk for becoming problem gamblers. So everyone who was an at-risk gambler, a problem gambler, people gambled on a weekly basis, people have spent more than $1,200 a year on gambling and prior military service. And 65% of those people responded. By wave 5, we had about an 80% retention rate, which is pretty good for cohort studies. 80% of the people who are eligible to participate actually did complete wave 5. Now, one of the fortunate things is that this cohort study just missed out on COVID. So, but that's a good thing because the results are not impacted by closure of casinos or anything else that might have changed the trajectory of gambling here. So the final collection was in 2019, but the large majority of people were assessed prior to COVID actually happening. Next slide. So the first objective is changes in level of gambling and problem gambling within the cohort that might identify impacts of Massachusetts casino introduction. So the next few slides are about that. So yeah. So what this shows is the vertical lines show the opening of the 3 casinos. PPC is Plainridge Park Casino, MGM Springfield Casino, EBH Encore Boston Harbor, and the horizontal lines show the level of gambling participation on individual formats across the 5 waves. And so Two or three important things there. The most noticeable change are those red lines. Now, the red lines convey casino patronage, and the solid red line shows that this is out-of-state casino patronage, shows that it was a significant decrease from about 33% prior to the first casino being open to about 16%, 15.7% in 2019 after MGM had opened. At the same time, the broken line shows patronage at Massachusetts casinos, which would be 0 at wave 2 because there weren't any, and has increased to 16% in wave 5. And I mean, this is good news. This is a good part of the reason for the introduction of casinos in Massachusetts, to redirect the money from other states locally. Now, the other important thing to notice is no real change in lottery participation. We have 3 types of lottery there. Traditional lottery, that's the top line, Powerball, Mega Millions, things like that. Daily lottery games, it's a solid green line, and instant tickets or scratch tickets, that's the pink-purple line. And basically, there wasn't any significant change there. There was some concern that casinos might cannibalize some of that. There's no evidence of that. In fact, there was, as you can see, there's a bit of an increase in traditional lottery patronage and daily lottery patronage beginning in wave 3. Now, part of that's artifactual. You gotta remember that the baseline survey was just a basic assessment of socioeconomic indices, because the purpose of that was for SEIGMA, social and economic impacts. It was really only in wave 3 that we significantly expanded the questionnaire, because now we also had a mandate to develop a logical model of problem gambling. So it was a much expanded questionnaire, and some of those minor changes in question wording did have an impact, and we think that's what happened with the daily lottery increase. We think it's really artifactual. Next slide. So perhaps most important is, what's the impact of casino openings on problem gambling? So we have 4 categories of gamblers: non-gamblers, black line; recreational gamblers, large majority of gamblers, green line; at-risk gamblers, yellow line; and problem gamblers, the red line. And we do see a significant increase in recreational gambling in wave 3, from 68% to 72.5%. And we think that was likely to, there was a massive Powerball jackpot in 2016. And so a lot of people who didn't normally buy lottery tickets, bought lottery tickets, and that changed the, so you have a corresponding decrease in non-gamblers and an increase in recreational gamblers, probably due to Powerball. But the other interesting and important change was that there was statistically significant changes in problem gambling. Wave 4 at 3.8% was significantly higher than some of those earlier waves, and that high rate continued in wave 5, 3.7%. Now, the really peculiar thing here is that this increase occurred prior to the 2 major casinos being open. Plainridge Park Casino was by far the smallest of the 3. And so, yeah, there's evidence that casino introduction might have something to do with a significant increase within the cohort of problem gambling, but it may not be due to their actual physical availability. And I'll speak more to that in a minute. Next slide. So that's a snapshot of the impacts of potential impacts of casino introduction. The second general research question is the stability of the 4 categories of gamblers across time. Next slide. So what this represents is the 322 non-gamblers at wave 1. Now, each of those represents the trajectory. There's 322 lines there in that graphic, and it shows the status of each of those 322 people across time. And then I've grouped those people to give you an idea of what's happening. So again, white represents non-gambling status, green represents a recreational gambling, yellow represents at risk, and red represents problem. So essentially what this shows is that non-gamblers is a fairly stable category, with the majority of people who are non-gambling wave 1 were also non-gamblers in wave 2, and most of those non-gamblers in wave 3. That said, it's not uncommon to move into recreational gambling, and if you move into recreational gambling, move back into non-gambling, because all it takes is buying the one lottery ticket or one raffle ticket in the past year, and then your category has changed. So, yeah, next slide. This is recreational gambling. Now, this is the large majority of the participants. This is 1,472 people, and each of those bars, each of those lines represents 50 individuals. Now, this is the most stable of the 4 categories. It shows that the huge majority of people who are recreational gamblers continue to be recreational gamblers in the next wave, and most people who are recreational gamblers through all their waves, and likely throughout their lifetime as well. A small percentage do transition into non-gambling or at-risk gambling, and even a smaller percentage, 3.9%, became problem gamblers, the red, at some point. Next slide. Now, this slide and the next slide are more important. This represents the at-risk gamblers. Wave 1, 262 people at wave 1 were at-risk gamblers, and this shows their course over the 5 waves. Now, this is the most unstable of all categories. The majority of people who are in the at-risk category transition to recreational gambling in the next category. Now, you can see at the bottom there, a significant minority nonetheless transition to problem gambling. But what this points to is that problem gambling is not this inevitable progression, that the large majority of people who develop excesses, get their fingers burnt, and then start controlling their gambling. And as you can see, the evidence here that once they get into trouble, they revert back to a safer form. That said, that if you've been at risk gambling at some point, have a higher risk of going into problem gambling at another point. Next slide. And this is the most important one. What this shows is anyone who's a problem gambler in any of the 5 waves. Now, this is sort of intermediate in terms of stability. But a couple of important things here. 1 year is the modal duration of the condition. That the majority of problem gamblers are only problem gamblers for 1 wave. And that's different from the, chronicity that a lot of people presume about addictions more generally. Now, it is chronic in the sense that you can see that even though about half of people, you can see at the top one is the top section illustrative of this point, that about half people remit, are not problem gamblers in the next wave. But the other half are chronic. They're problem gamblers in the next wave, and a lot of those are problem gamblers in the wave after that. And in fact, chronicity predict chronicity. The more times that you're consecutive, the more times you're likely to be consecutive in the next wave. But nonetheless, the duration episode for most, the modal duration episode is only one time period. But it's chronic in the sense that there's huge rates of both remission and relapse. So a lot of those people who remitted in wave 2, 3, or 4, you can see have relapsed in later waves. And the importance of this, if you look at wave 4 and 5, this illustrates all the people in the cohort who are problem gamblers. If you remember, we had a significant increase in problem gambling wave 4 and 5. And what this illustrates is wave 5, the large majority of those people are not new problem gamblers. They are relapsed problem gamblers. And that relapse occurring prior to the major casinos being open. Next slide. We think it might be due to the interest, the media attention, the coverage, and generally the hoopla associated with these imminent openings of casinos. So what we have here is the top graphic shows the number of news stories in each month of the year. You can't read the x-axis particularly well, but the red lines illustrate the opening of 3 casinos, PPC, then MGM, then Encore, and the light yellow quadrants illustrate the assessment periods, and there's 5 of them, assessment 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you can see that the point being made here is in the top graphic, the number of news stories about any of the new casino introductions in Massachusetts peaked prior to the venues actually being opened. Now, research has shown that problem gamblers often report that advertising triggers relapse. Anything that reminds them of gambling is a potentially trigger for craving, and craving being a trigger for relapse. And this really supports the contention that, well, there definitely was more news stories associated with that. The bottom graphic, now just because you're exposed to news stories doesn't mean you've attended to them. So the bottom graphic shows the number of Google searches in Massachusetts during those same periods of time. And you can see, for the most part, the number of people in Massachusetts searching for casino, MGM, Encore Boston Harbor peaked just prior to those casinos being open. So it supports the contention that this high relapse rate in 4 and 5 had to do with the hoopla associated with the imminent casino openings. Next slide. So the next section is the bivariate and multivariate predictors of current and future problem gambling. Yeah. So we did it a few different ways to cover all our bases. We had both a discrete and continuous dependent variable. So the discrete variable was whether you're a problem gambler. The instrument we used, the problem pathological gambling measure, but we also did a continuous measure, which is PPGM total score. We used 105 independent variables. Everything, we looked at all the prior longitudinal studies, and every single variable that was of etiological importance. Any of those studies were included in the MAGIC study. And we did both concurrent and lagged analysis. The problem with a lot of cohort studies is they look at covariation of the independent variables with the dependent variable over time. The problem is that some of these variables, like mental health, like depression is a strong correlate of problem gambling, and it may well be a cause or precipitator of problem gambling, but it's obviously potential consequence of problem gambling as well. And that's true for several of the variables associated with problem gambling. So to more unambiguously establish their etiological importance in terms of precipitating or causing, we also looked at did a lagged analysis, whether, say, depression or impulsivity or gambling involvement in the prior wave predicted problem gambling in the subsequent wave. So it's a stronger causal attribution. And the method we use is generalized estimating equations that allows for the assessment of the covariation of these variables over time, allowing for correlated observations. It's a common modern technique for assessing doing longitudinal research over time. Next slide. So the bivariate results, there were only 16 variables with no significant concurrent or future relationship with problem gambling. And they're listed there. I'm not going to go into these in detail so I can get to the main findings more importantly. But the italicized ones are the ones that have been significant in other research. There's a couple of peculiar ones here. Age. So age was not significant related to problem gambling in Massachusetts. That was also found in the baseline general population survey. So it's a kind of a unique Massachusetts finding. And that's partly why we're doing this, because the findings in MAGIC are somewhat contextual to Massachusetts. The results are somewhat different in Canada, Sweden, New Zealand, Australia, etc. But age, being an immigrant, and this is a strange one or interesting one as well, but proximity to the closest EGM, electronic gambling machine venue or table game venue, was not related to problem gambling status, level of stress, and child abuse. So those are findings that are different from what's been found in others. And our employment status and having served in the military were significant in our baseline, but were not in our cohort. Next slide. Now, the large majority of variables, as we suspected, because we chose the variables that were significant in all the other studies, and this confirms this, 67 variables with significant concurrent and lagged bivariate relationship, additional 22 with significant concurrent or lagged. Next slide. Next slide. So for bivariate results, the strongest independent variables of both concurrent and future relationship with problem gambling were gambling-related variables. Biggest loss in a single day, biggest win in a single day, the intensity of gambling involvement, number of formats involved in, how much is spending, frequency, the importance, self-rated importance of gambling as recreational activity, and current gambling category, whether you're a non-gambler, recreational gambler, at-risk gambler, problem gambler. Now, this is not surprising for concurrent relationships. I mean, these are all aspects of the construct, being a problem gambler. But it's important that these things are also strongly predictive of future problem gambling. The point being made here is that heavy gambling involvement is the final common pathway and the immediate precursor to problem gambling. Next slide. So there are many other variables robustly predicted, both concurrently and prospectively. One of the strongest ones was actually instant lottery or scratch ticket participation, traditional lottery participation. This might also seem strange to people from other jurisdictions, but Massachusetts is kind of unique in terms of its involvement in lotteries. As far as I'm aware, Massachusetts has the highest per capita expenditure on lottery products in the world at $776 per person. So it's kind of unique in that way. Now, higher levels of psychopathy or antisociality, have family member being a regular gambler, current substance use disorder, lifetime history of drug or alcohol problem, greater proportion of friends and family, regular gamblers, higher impulsivity. Next slide. Higher level gambling fallacies, more significant life events. Yeah, actually we can go through, I'll just give you a second to look at each of these. Basically, it's all the usual suspects, all the things that have been shown to be related to problem gambling in prior cross-sectional longitudinal research also showed up as significant here. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So independent variables are often correlated with each other. So the fact that you've got educational attainment and income and ethnicity all being significant doesn't tell you what's the driver here. There may be, it's just one of these things that's driving the relationship, and the other things are sort of tagging along. So the relative importance of independent variables is better established in a stepwise multivariate analysis, where independent variables having the strongest association with the dependent variable enter the model first, and other independent variables only enter the model if they add additional predictive power beyond the shared variance. So the multivariate results disentangle of all those, 80 odd bivariate relationships. Which ones actually have a multivariate? Which ones are the drivers of these relationships? Next slide. So here again, the strongest independent variable, no, previous slide. The strongest independent variables of both concurrent and future problem gambling were, again, gambling-related variables. So again, points to intensive gambling involvement being the immediate prior cursor to future problem gambling. Next slide. That's not surprising. The more important thing is beyond intensive gambling involvement, what else predicted? So impulsivity, high rates of impulsivity, strongly and robustly predictive of, there's only 12 variables beyond the gambling related variables. So it really pared down from the 80, 90 variables that were significant. Daily lottery game participation, instant lottery scratch ticket participation, higher number of significant property financial life events in the past 12 months. So these are both positive events, like you have a financial windfall, or it's that you've incurred a large debt and taken on a mortgage. It's just significant change in financial status. Lower levels of happiness, lower household income. Next slide. Male gender, traditional lottery participation. You don't often see that variable showing up in multivariate models of problem gambling, but again, Massachusetts is somewhat unique. problems with drugs and alcohol prior to the past 12 months, higher levels of antisociality, psychopathy, sports betting participation, and higher levels of gambling fallacy. Next slide. A separate analysis, as Rachel mentioned, that we not only looked at things that predicted problem gambling, but we also did a sub-analysis on the problem gamblers to look at, as you know, half of those people remitted the next time, but the other half continued. And so we did separate analyses just on the problem gamblers, looking at the variables that best predicted continuation versus remission. And really 4 groupings of variables. No prior lifetime problems with gambling. That makes sense. Past history is still a very strong predictor of future history. So the people who weren't problem gamblers ever before, much more likely to remit next time. But people who had a longer term history of problem gambling, more likely to continue. Less severe manifestations of the problem gambling, lower scores, lower gambling expenditure. And that's also consistent with common sense. The more severe manifestations of any disorder usually predicts greater chronicity. So people who didn't have it as bad, but nonetheless were problem gamblers, more likely to remit than people who had much more severe manifestations. Fewer comorbidities. So lack of mental disorders, fewer life events, less impulsivity, absence of behavioral addictions. These things drag people down. And I mean, I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I can tell you that one of the essential things you do as a clinician is that you got to have a broad scope, that people with the presenting problem usually have a range of other problems. And unless you deal with the multitude of issues that the person is presenting with, recovery the chances of recovery are not nearly significant unless you deal with those other things. Same thing occurs here. I mean, if you've got major depression, if you've got huge debt, if you've got marital problems, you've got employment problems, these things cut into your resolve ability to rein in your problem gambling. And so it's all these other things that are dragging you down. And that was one of the significant predictors. And really importantly, fewer gambling fallacies. What this potentially suggests is that people who are getting into trouble were more likely to think that they could potentially recoup their losses. And so the important point of intervention. Next slide. Supplemental descriptive results, additional results here that contextualize some of the findings thus far. Next slide. So the first one is prevention awareness. So we asked everyone in this study whether they'd heard media campaigns to prevent problem gambling in Massachusetts the past 12 months. And only about half of them had. But more concerning is the fact that the percentage of people who were aware of it was decreasing over time in wave 4 and 5. Even fewer people were aware of prevention programs at their school, in their work, or in the community, only about 16.7%. Very few people participated in those prevention programs at work or school, and very few people who actually had heard the media programs reported that it actually changed their behavior. Now, that would be the best judge of that, but self-report suggests fairly small impact. Next slide. This is an important slide. So we asked every problem gambler, are there particular types of gambling that have contributed to problems more than others? Too much stock is put into certain forms of gambling being more problematic than others. I mean, alcoholics may have a preferred beverage, but all forms of alcohol create problems. And that's also true of problem gamblers. And I've asked this question in many studies before. You always get the same result. It's only a minority of problem gamblers say, yeah, it's slot machines, or yeah, it's scratch tickets. It's everything. They may have preferred formats, but it's only it's only the minority of people who really have a particular problematic form. Now, for the people who did say there's a particularly problematic form, scratch tickets were identified as the most problematic. Slot machines followed by that. Traditional lottery tickets, online gambling didn't even show up. Next slide. Also important from prevention and treatment perspective, we asked all problem gamblers, have you wanted help for gambling problems the past 12 months. When the numbers are below, with cell size below 5, we suppress the values. But as you can see, only a tiny minority, only 70.8% of people said they wanted help for problem gambling. Of those who wanted help, only a third of them got help. And it was actually twice as common for people to self-exclude from a casino, either in Massachusetts, Connecticut, or some adjoining state. Next slide. It's an interesting and important aspect of the study. Every problem gambler was asked an open-ended question. So what do you think caused your problem gambling? A couple of overriding results here. One is that most people had an answer. Second is that the answers were unusually circumscribed and simple, that they didn't have a particularly complex understanding of what it was, or at least they weren't willing to describe it. We categorized these self-reports of what they thought caused problem gambling into these categories. The desire to win money was the number one. Now, obviously that doesn't make a lot of sense because of the negative mathematical expectation of commercial casino games. But it's important, and it reinforces the role of gambling fallacies, not understanding how gambling works as a driver of problem gambling. Boredom, excitement, enjoyment, next most important. But 9% of problem gamblers denied they had a problem, even though they scored in the problem gambling range. Minority for escape, self-control, chasing losses, and a few others. Next slide. Finally, the policy implications. So I got a few minutes to, we'd finished that analysis a few weeks ago, and then we've been racking our brains about, so what's all this mean? And this is our first cut at what we think these results mean. Next slide. So for the most part, as you saw, that all the usual suspects, for the most part, showed up again as significant. So these results largely confirm previous research. Consequently, they provide a more solid scientific footing for prior recommendations how to prevent problem gambling that have assumed that those predictors were in fact valid, and we've confirmed that. Now, the large number of predictors might be daunting to some people, but it also points to a fairly important fact, which is that addictions generally, and problem gambling in this case more specifically, has a biopsychosocial etiology. There's no silver bullet. There's no single factor that creates problem gambling. There's multiple different roots. Each problem gambler has a unique array of risk factors. There may be certain risk factors that are more common amongst most of them, but everyone's fairly unique. There's lots of different ways to develop problems. And so you need to tackle problem gambling from a multi-directional way as well in order to tackle it. Next slide. Now, very robust association with substance abuse and mood disorders in this finding and all the other prior longitudinal findings. So it's pretty clear that because of their etiological connection, effective treatment of substance abuse and mood disorders will also help reduce the future incidence of problem gambling, both the onset of problem gambling and its continuation, as we saw that these comorbidities facilitated continuation. And so if these mental health problems and substance use problems are treated, then we'll have less future first onset problem gambling, less continuation of problem gambling. So for similar reasons, it's useful to screen for problem gambling for people presenting for mental health or substance use problems. But you don't need any complicated 10-item screen, a simple consumption screen, much less sensitive, simply asking how frequently do you gamble and how much money do you spend on gambling. You don't have to ask about problem gambling symptomatology, but a 2-item screen would do the job and be a very efficient way of picking up problem gamblers. Number 4, limit the placement of gambling opportunities in the marketing of gambling in lower socioeconomic neighborhoods. Now, a really important finding in Massachusetts is that now all the usual suspects turned up as correlates. Race, ethnicity, educational attainment, income, gender, employment, but a lot of those were correlated with each other, and that only 2 demographic variables that rose above all the rest and seem to be driving this, and low income was the predominant one. Now, it's going to be the case that certain minority groups are going to be, you have more African Americans and Hispanics in lower socioeconomic neighborhoods, but it's not race, ethnicity that's driver, it's the lack of income, poverty. You know, gamblers want to win money, and having lower income seems to be a driver of getting into gambling and going into problem gambling. Next slide. Educational efforts are needed to promote knowledge, motivations, attitudes conducive to responsible gambling. The demographic focus of these educational efforts has to be on all ages, race, ethnicities, and genders, with extra focus on males, that was the other demographic risk factor, and lower income groups. Again, these attributes may be concentrated in certain neighborhoods, but again, it's income and gender that's the stronger drivers. Location, media campaigns, school-based programs. I don't believe that Massachusetts has any school-based prevention programs for gambling. In mental health and substance abuse clinics, in the gambling venues, we have that already with GameSense, and on the gambling product itself. Content focus, really important one is countering gambling fallacies. That's one of the few modifiable risk factors, and it seems to be a driver of why people become problem gamblers, why people continue staying in problem gambling. So it's important. Risk factors for problem gambling identified in the present research to see, like, not everyone's at the same risk for problem gambling, not everyone's at the same risk for addiction. It has to do with your propensity, first of all, your genetic propensity, but also the collection of attributes we identified here. If you have those, you're much higher at risk than other people. So being aware of those risk factors. Lower risk gambling guidelines, international effort to identify expenditure levels and gambling involvement attributes that predict problem-free gambling, and those are being announced imminently. And so promoting those as would be quite helpful as well. And finally, symptoms of problem gambling and where to get help. Next slide. Limited advertising. Like, as far as I'm aware, this might be the first study that provides some evidence to support the anecdotal information reported by problem gamblers that advertising precipitates relapse. We can't prove that, but it's very tantalizing. Now we're going to do a follow-up general population survey next year to determine the current prevalence of problem gambling in Massachusetts compared to the baseline. Now, and that will be the more unambiguous evidence whether problem gambling has increased in the state or not. The rates in the cohort are within the cohort. They don't speak to prevalence in the state. They should be aligned with changes in prevalence in the state, but they don't actually provide prevalence figures. But anyways, I mean, a lot of jurisdictions do prohibit advertising and gambling, and for this very reason. Increased availability of self-help materials. Only minority of problem gamblers want or will ever seek out formal treatment. Let's just recognize that. I mean, this is just common sense. If you or I have problems, we don't seek out the help of strangers. We try and deal with it ourselves. And it's only after we fail repeatedly that we might seek external help. So let's empower people with materials that will help them in their own efforts. That said, encourage treatment seeking, because people who actually do seek formal treatment have better long-term outcomes than people who don't. Now, you got to strive for abstinence. That's a truism for addictions more generally. But as you saw from one of those earlier slides, one of the interesting things about all those problem gamblers who relapsed, like almost none of those people moved to non-gambling in the next wave. They all became at-risk gamblers or recreational gamblers. It's common sense that you're so enamored with this activity, you don't want to give it up completely. And so it's just natural that they try to rein it in. But that's probably a good part of the reason why the relapse rates are so high. So, but that said, you got to recognize that most problem gamblers don't want to give it up. They want to fool themselves into thinking they could rein it in. So maybe you agree that'll be an initial step. Let's start reining it in. And with failed efforts to control it, they recognize they have to go for abstinence. Treating comorbid mental health problems and gambling fallacies is essential. Next slide. And finally, last slide, implement policies recommended by other research. I mean, this wasn't derived from the MAGIC findings, but has been derived from prevention research elsewhere. Restrict access to ATMs and gambling venues, mandatory pre-commitment on player reward cards, automated alerts to players when their gambling behavior escalates. One of the problems with reward cards is that it's kind of peculiar that you're rewarding consumption. We generally don't do that for tobacco products or alcohol products or prescription drugs. The more you buy, the more discount you'll get on the future ones. But we do that with gambling, and it's counterproductive. And so what you could do and should be doing is rewarding responsible gambling, that you don't get any points after you spent $200 or $500. You get extra points if you do have a problem gambling screen or counter some gambling fallacies, etc. So very easy to change the contingencies there. Restrict alcohol on the gaming floor and limit the availability of gambling. Now, Massachusetts is kind of unique. Like a lot of US residents don't realize that age restrictions on gambling, on casino participation are not common worldwide. It's 18 or 19 in Canada, and it's 18, 19, most other countries in the world. United States is a bit different that way, but continued, even though Massachusetts, there is not an age, younger ages don't seem to have higher risk. It's still good practice to limit age. The products within casinos are generally riskier than other products. And so continued age restrictions for casinos, continued prohibitions of EGMs outside of dedicated gambling venues. In Canada, the 2 provinces without any slot machines or video lotto terminals outside of casinos, Ontario, British Columbia, have Canada's lowest rate of problem gambling. All the other provinces, like my province, Alberta, we have slot machines and VLTs at all bars, and so there's thousands of venues, and that's a problem. And finally, limitations on online gambling, because that is associated with problem gambling in most jurisdictions. Last slide. And that's it. As Rachel mentioned, we're moving directly to the panel discussion. We'll take all questions at the very end of the panel discussion. So over to you, panel.
All right, so we have 4 distinguished panelists with us today. As I mentioned, we have Mark Vanderlinden, Director of Research and Responsible Gaming at the Gaming Commission. We have Victor Ortiz from the Department of Public Health, Office of Problem Gambling Services. We have Marlene Warner, who is Executive Director of the newly named Massachusetts Council on Gaming and Health. And finally, we have Judith Glenn joining us from Toronto. The way I am going to do this panel is I am going to pose a question to you each individually. And then we will move on to some questions that more than one of you we think able to answer. But we wanted to give each of you an opportunity to shine individually first. So this first question is for Mark. At-risk gambling had the most unstable pattern, with only a minority of people continuing in this category in the next wave, and very few remaining in the category in all 5 waves. So although a significant percentage of at-risk gamblers subsequently became problem gamblers, a much more common route was for at-risk gamblers to transition back to recreational gambling. And we are wondering, what does the Commission do and what else could be done to serve at-risk gamblers in Massachusetts?
Thank you, Rachel and Rob, for that question and for the presentation. And overall, it's been great working with you over the last 5 years on this. So regarding the question, this is a really important group, at-risk gamblers. Not only do they show great volatility, meaning that there's a lot of opportunity to work with them, they're a big group, right? And in the slide, it showed up anywhere between 12.6 and 10.6%. And the baseline general population survey, I want to say it's around 8.4%. So we're talking about a significant number of people, and we're really interested in working with them. Obviously, the Gaming Commission has a number of initiatives that specifically target this group already, being led by our GameSense program at each of the casinos. And when I was looking at, so what were the predictors? So for example, gambling fallacies, or a large loss, or a big win. These are important pieces of information for us to integrate when we think about taking the structure that we currently have and crafting information or messaging that would support that. We've always, and this is outlined in our responsible gaming framework, we have a stepped care approach, meaning that we take a specific approach when looking at recreational gamblers, or a strategy at-risk gamblers and with problem gamblers. And so for these individuals, for this at-risk group, what I think this study can help us with is kind of building out our approach in working with individuals that are at risk. I think that there's another piece of this too that, and perhaps Marlene will touch on this, which is an initiative by the Commission now to promote positive play. Also, again, beginning to not look at everybody as just a gambler, but beginning to look at them as individuals and what their individuals' needs are. And so the Positive Play Initiative has pointed out we need to focus on gambling literacy, which kind of supports this idea of there are gambling fallacies out there. It also really focused on pre-commitment, which is setting a budget and supporting people in their decisions to stick with that budget. So these are ways in which I think the Gaming Commission will continue to work in this direction, and try to integrate to the degree that we can kind of the vast amount of information that's contained in this presentation and in the report. The other thing I just wanted to mention is the low risk gambling guidelines, which Rob had mentioned. I think these are fantastic. It's a product the Magic Study contributed to the development of the International Low Risk Gambling Guidelines. And once they're ready for rollout, we will certainly look to put those in place, not just through the GameSense program, but in other avenues that we can as well.
Great. Thank you, Mark. This next question is for Victor. So the recommendation number 3 that we came up with suggests effective treatment of substance abuse and/or mood disorders will also help reduce the future incidence of problem gambling. What are your thoughts on screening for gambling consumption for people who are seeking help at mental health or substance abuse treatment facilities?
So Dr. Williams and Dr. Volberg, thank you for the presentation. I concur with Mark. It's really a pleasure to be on this panel, and thank you for the invitation. And I'll try to answer these questions without my dog barking in the background or the construction that's happening on my street here, hence the reality of what we all virtual. I think, Rachel, before I answer that question, I think that there are a couple of points I want to raise, and then I want to get to this question. But I think that overall, the Department of Public Health, our commitment is to ensure optimal health and well-being for everyone. And one of the things that I want to raise and lift up as part of our conversation, or as part of this recommendation, is that we must acknowledge that the field of problem gambling has historically been disconnected from the community experience of gambling and people of color. And we must put equity at the forefront in order to mitigate harms associated with gambling. With that being said, your question in regards to treatment is important in screening. We've understood for the last 20 years that universal screenings and behavioral health is important because early detection allows us the opportunity to be able to engage and prevent identify and set prevention pathways for health and well-being. The question becomes, how do you operationalize that? Because that's, conceptually we understand that, but how do you operationalize that? And one of the things that I can point to is one of the newest initiatives at the Department of Public Health. As of July 1st this year, last year in 2020, we integrated the problem gambling helpline within the substance abuse helpline. And at the center of that integration was to enhance the caller's experience as well as expand our reach. Previously, we would receive on an annual basis about 400 calls per year on the problem gambling helpline. And with a new initiative, we're not only able to serve the 400 or so callers that will call on an annual basis, but we now are able to screen 15 to 20,000 individuals who call for substance abuse. We can screen them for problem gambling. I have been informed that this is probably the largest expansion of problem gambling screening in the country. And it really is a testament of not only that work, but I think that that's the blueprint that will serve as a model as we think about what we are learning from that experience and expand it in other sectors, because we must be able to think critically about integrating gambling within not only substance abuse and mental health, as Dr. Williams pointed out, of the complexities of these issues. But if we are not only should integrate it, but as I mentioned earlier, we also need to give critical thought to those who are disproportionately impacted by gambling, and specifically ensure that we promote equity and put that at the forefront of our work. So I think that, yes, universal screenings are important, and I believe our newest initiative as Helpline really serves as a model for that.
Great, thank you, Victor. Marlene, you're up next. Recommendation number 5 in our report suggests additional educational efforts are needed to promote knowledge, motivations, and attitudes conducive to responsible gambling. The recommendation provides many potential targets for increased educational efforts. Where would you see these efforts best being focused, and what role do you see the council having in operationalizing this recommendation?
Well, thank you, Rachel, and thanks to Rob as well. And Magic has been so informative for our practice and our work, so we just want to give huge kudos to your whole team around this data. I just want to say that Mark started talking a little bit about GameSense. I do think that GameSense has kind of revolutionized how we talk about gambling and talk about it directly with players. And I think Magic has brought out the fact that if you're not talking directly to the people as they're playing, where you're kind of missing out. So I think that the opportunity to address gambling fallacies and really be specific around gambling literacy as it relates to certain games, as it relates to certain behaviors, as it relates to an individual's relationship with gambling is so important. And that's what those GameSense advisors are currently doing and need to increase. And so one of the things that was also brought out was around people's relationship to, I think it was addressed as hobbies or recreational activities, and that gambling is a predominant one for some people who have currently problem gambling or have some, it's a predictive factor towards having problem gambling. It's another thing that GameSense can really address, is making sure that this is not the primary thing that you do in your spare time, or the primary way that you're spending your money in your monthly budget, but really contextualizing in a larger concept of what life looks like. The other thing that was brought up was around the issue of living with or previously experiencing substance use disorder or other mental health disorders. The interesting thing, again, is that GameSense is able to talk with individuals one-on-one about their relationship with or the various struggles that they have, and making sure that even if they want to continue to gamble, making sure that they have a therapist to address some of the other issues. And it's amazing how upfront and personal people will get with the details they're giving, but making sure that they're connecting. So to Victor's point, it's fantastic that they're screening on the helpline. We are referring people to that helpline, and so that they can get the help both with their substance use disorder, but also if they're at the point where they're needing treatment, they can do both in that one place. So that's fantastic. I also think operators own part of this. So GameSense is certainly there and having those conversations, but they also want to make sure, you know, in years past, the Mass Council has offered big win letters via previous lottery administrations to people who've won big. Something else casinos could do, making sure literature and education is being given to people who win big, and win big could mean something different to every person, but a big win. But also people that are tracking losses. The casinos can certainly, they send a lot of information via their player rewards cards. They certainly could send information about what that might look like for an individual and how they could connect back to GameSense, how they could connect to treatment, how they connect to the helpline. Operators can also be involved in the education piece. And then third, I would say professional education should certainly focus on screening. So Victor talked about, you know, this huge initiative of the helpline. And I think, again, that's fantastic. I also think making sure that we have some shorter term resources. Again, we know people don't always access treatment. So what are some of those other places people are accessing? So whether that's going and looking at churches, whether that's, you know, community centers, gyms, you know, you name it. Those are other places that we can make sure that our resources and screens are happening. So I think education is the responsibility really of everyone. And the Mass Council is certainly here to help facilitate that.
Great. Thank you, Marlene. All right, Judith, you're up last, and then we're going to pose some questions for all of you to jump in on. But this question is for Judith. Magic found that daily lottery, instant lottery tickets, traditional lottery, and sports betting participation were the types of gambling most robustly associated with concurrent and future problem gambling in Massachusetts. And I want to know from an international perspective whether this surprises you.
Thank you, Rachel. Certainly, it did surprise me, but in many ways it provided some validating information. It's been my experience that in research studies that found a large role for lottery, it was almost always dismissed as just an indication of widespread gambling involvement. So lottery is just the most common form of gambling. It's not linked to problems. It's very low risk. And yet there have always been a small number of studies that looked particularly at things like instant break open scratch tickets. And more recently, this proliferation of daily or near instant lotteries, where you have throughout the day, there will be wins. And so there has always been a small body of work looking at that form of gambling and associating it with high risk. And I think a couple of things have happened. One is that blurring of lottery play with just as an indication of gambling involvement. And also the folks who are the most vulnerable to this form of gambling are the most vulnerable in our society in many ways. In Ontario, for example, you see that those forms of gambling are most risky for low-income women with low education. So the other thing that happened is that during COVID, there was an acceleration of the sales of instant and near instant lottery tickets in a number of jurisdictions. So what you saw was that as casinos were closed, people were going for the form of gambling that most closely approximated sort of that rapid feedback that you get from things like slot machines and even table games. And so, you know, what I find very interesting is that you were able to, and albeit in a state that has an extremely popular lottery, but I think your finding has been pretty interesting for other jurisdictions where, for example, in the UK, instant win tickets came up to be almost 50% of their lottery sales. And this kind of increase happened worldwide. And so to be able to point to not only your data around your multivariate analysis, but your self-report data that confirms the role of lottery in potentially putting people at risk, I found that a very interesting kind of nuanced finding. And my thoughts were, of course, that we need to maybe think a little bit more about those retail settings and up our game in those settings. And as you introduce sports betting, which in some jurisdictions is heading into those retail settings, and as you try to disperse the profitability of gambling from just casinos to smaller businesses in hospitality and retail, we're going to have to think about upping our game in those settings. That was certainly my thought.
Great, thank you. All right, so now I've got a question that I think is most relevant to Mark and Victor, but of course, other members of the panel can chime in. Policy recommendation number 4 suggests limiting the placement of gambling opportunities and the marketing of gambling in lower socioeconomic neighborhoods. So Mark, we wonder if you would comment on the regulatory implications of such a recommendation. And Victor, we're wondering about your thoughts on this recommendation from a public health perspective. So, thoughts? Mark, you're muted.
I'm back. It's a really complex question and issue to try to grapple with. Let me just say that up front. You know, the commission's work so far through our responsible gaming framework that addresses advertising primarily focuses on underage gamblers. The commission has a regulation specifically about advertising for underage gambling. So this is an important finding, and I think it's certainly been an issue that's been bubbling up and something for us to take a closer look at. You know, in terms of targeted advertising, the reason why I think it's become so complicated is that we're no longer talking about billboards or you know, radio ads or newspaper ads. We're talking much more about social media and how, you know, algorithms are used to track your behavior and send you targeted messages. It doesn't care what neighborhood you live in. It cares what your you know, what your behavior is in that online space. So I think that the Gaming Commission, you know, I can't speak for the 5 or 4 commissioners, soon to be 5, but I think that it is something that the commission can take a look at with this new information in place, as well as the feedback that we've been receiving over time, to try to seriously consider, you know, what should we do with the current regulations that we have. The responsible gaming framework has always said that we will use, you know, the research that's being created, and we will update that framework over time, and this is certainly the case there. The framework has largely been adopted by our licensees as kind of their template for their responsible gaming plan. So I think there is absolutely opportunity here. I think trying to figure out the best platform and way to do that is the question, but I appreciate the finding.
Thanks, Mark. Victor?
I think one of the things I want to point out before I get into that question is you know, in Massachusetts, unlike any other jurisdiction, that we have really a phenomenal really opportunity where you have a public health institution like the Department of Public Health, which is one of the oldest or the oldest public health institution in the country, working alongside a regulatory body like the Mass Gaming Commission and working together in sort of a collective way to mitigate harm. And I think that's extremely unique that we have in Massachusetts compared to others. And so that being said, I think that in this response to this question, we need to think that whatever pathways we take, that it needs to be comprehensive, because, you know, there's a lot to untangle there in regards to the advertisement there, and Mark touched on the complexity and the challenges there. But I also want to lift up too that communities, specifically communities that are low socioeconomic communities, are facing great distress. Begin without advertisement, and the advertisement only, and advertisement that could only enhance a lot of those issues. And so it's important for us to think critically about these communities from a public health perspective as we think about the social determinants of health, because it is those social determinants of health that is responsible for 95% of health outcomes and is where we see the greatest levels of inequities. So I think that we need to make, my recommendation is that whatever our responsive, that we think on a more macro and the specific to communities that really lifts up, again, those equity related matters, because again, we can make a mistake by only singling out the advertisement and not looking at the broader complexities of communities and the challenges that are faced at the community level. So I think any response to that requires us to think in a more comprehensive way.
All right, this is a question for our Massachusetts panelists. Sorry, Judith, I've got another question for you later. Policy recommendation number 7 advocates for an increase in the availability of self-help materials for at-risk and problem gamblers, or for everyone. Mark, I guess the question for you is, what role do you think the Gaming Commission has in expanding the availability of self-help materials? Victor, we wonder where you see an increase in the availability of self-help materials being most useful, and is this something that the Office of Problem Gambling Services has the capacity to expand on? And Marlene, where do you see the increase in the availability of self-help materials being most useful? So I'm going to use my prerogative as the moderator and ask Mark to start.
Okay. You know, I mentioned in my first response about the step care approach, and specifically for at-risk and persons who are at risk and persons who are experiencing gambling harm, making sure that there are tools and resources that are available to them. You know, so from our GameSense program, we certainly have a connection to the voluntary self-exclusion program. We connect with the helpline and treatment resources that are available, as well as self-help groups. And self-help materials are included in that. It's an interesting finding that makes me think, let's go back and revisit how we're promoting those self-help materials, and can we do a better job of kind of highlighting those or elevating those so that we make sure that they're more widely available through the program. And I think it just also speaks to, you know, an ongoing partnership with the Department of Public Health, and how do we support them in the development and distribution of self-help materials. And kind of we have access to a lot of gamblers, quite honestly, and a lot of at-risk and persons who are at risk and persons who are experiencing harm. So how can we take what we're doing and supporting the work of the Department of Public Health to get those materials out and get people connected to help?
Great. Victor?
Well, one of the, it's a great question. So thank you, Rachel. And you know, one of the steps that we took at the Department of Public Health that we recognized from many of our evaluation, that there was really a disconnect of information that was very inconsistent. And we worked really hard to ensure that there's alignment of information that is consistent, so that as we roll it out to the general public, we avoid any possible misinformation or confusion. To that extent, since the time that I've been at the Department of Public Health, since 2016, we've developed materials. First step to change was revised. We revised that as well as provided a whole host of other materials that's centered around our campaigns, including general brochures and things of that nature. But I agree with Marlene's point. You know, we obviously have plans to continue to develop more materials, but so there's obviously a development aspect of materials, and we are committed to that. But there's also distribution of those materials, right? And so, as Marlene mentioned earlier, ensuring that we get those to various different touch points, whether they're churches, community organizations, things of that nature. We can obviously, I think it takes all hands on deck to ensure that we get information at every critical point. And I think that's all of our responsibility to make that happen. So I think that, yes, we have developed materials. There's a lot of room for us to continue to make improvements in development materials. And I think the distribution of materials can continue to use additional work to ensure that we get that information to a whole host of folks. And that's well coordinated.
Great. Thank you, Victor. Marlene?
So, I mean, I agree with everything Mark and Victor said. And I think, you know, I've been doing this a long time, and I'm an old lady. And I feel like one of the things I need to
Not as old as I am.
I need to get better about is the fact that people don't want to pick up brochures. They don't want anything in paper, right? Like, so just because that's what I did 20 years ago does not mean that's what we should be doing today. And so, you know, like in Problem Gambling Awareness Month, we're trying to geofence around the casino and target people who have been on site at the casino for 3 hours or more with a message about responsible gambling. We'll see if that works. I mean, those are the type of things that I think we need to start being more innovative about. We know we have 7,600 retailers across Massachusetts with density in areas such as Southeastern Mass, Chinatown, places like that. Those are the places we should be figuring out, how do we get onto their Waze app? How do we get into their social media? How do we send them messages? Because we don't know, because lottery is so brick and mortar, and we don't know if they're currently buying a ticket, but we can target that they're in a certain area. How do we get those messages? So when we think about self-help, we have to think about it in a whole new and different and innovative way. We're also in the process of finalizing an augmented reality app. We don't know if it'll work, but we're certainly hoping that that's another way that we can start to initiate conversations about gambling education, self-help. And then listen, you know, right now, if I wanted to go onto Amazon and I swear to God, if I thought the word, never mind, put it into my phone, it would come up with all these suggestions. It would immediately bring me to a map. It would do all these things. How do we get sophisticated in our approach so that, you know, I start to think about something, or I'm at a lottery retailer and then I can get connected to treatment resources. I can figure out how to get a GSA. I can kind of get the whole continuum. I can know what recovery center is down the road. We have 26, I think Victor can correct me, but I think it's like 26 recovery centers in Massachusetts right now. They're an amazing resource who have been well versed around gambling. So I think those are the type of things that I'd like to see a lot more of as it relates to self-help and thinking about how we can be a little bit more innovative. There's also the opportunity. One of the things we realized is our GameSense program is really strong and really awesome, but it's only when you're on site and if you're willing to walk up to a person in a green shirt. Not everybody, especially in the middle of COVID, not everybody wants to talk to someone. So if somebody is really struggling and wants to connect to treatment, they can call the Substance Abuse and Problem Gambling Helpline. If they want to talk to a GameSense advisor, they can live chat or call the Safer Gambling Education line. Just last night, somebody was texting or chatting with one of my staff members from a slot machine. They didn't want to walk over to the game set center, but they wanted to know something about the game. That's invaluable. Those are the type of self-help resources I think we need to continue to focus on.
Great. All right. So we've got 10 more minutes on this panel. I want to pose a question to Judith, and then I'm going to open this up for some discussion on a separate topic for everybody. But Judith, I wanted to get your thoughts on the recommendation that we have to provide rewards or incentives for responsible gambling behaviors.
Thank you, Rachel, for that question. Let me say as a preamble that you folks in Massachusetts are pretty hard on yourselves generally. I find that you're constantly criticizing yourselves and pushing yourselves forward. You should know that from where I sit in Toronto, Canada, and working with folks all over the world in this space, you really are leaders. And on this small point, I was delighted to see that leadership continue. Rob articulated very nicely why it's reasonable to provide incentives for responsible behaviors. And I've been very frustrated by the resistance to this kind of like ethical resistance to rewarding good behavior with things that might relate to gambling. And so I was delighted to see that you made that recommendation, and it is consistent with the health behavior literature. There's lots of evidence in the health behavior literature that when you provide incentives, even bald monetary incentives to get people to complete a treatment program, go have a PAP exam, quit smoking, and I've gone so far as to say, why don't we offer a monetary reward if someone completes a self-exclusion without breaching? And I know those are, sort of edgy suggestions, but I was really pleased to see you validate that direction, and Marlene talking about some of the innovative ways we can reach people. And I think it's a very valid suggestion to begin to reward people for doing things like setting limits, which you were the first jurisdiction, I believe, in the world to offer direct incentives for folks to sign up to your Play My Way program. And we're starting to see a small trickle of operators following that lead. But I can't emphasize enough how important I think providing rewards for responsible behavior is as a tool in helping people to reduce the impact, the negative impact of gambling in their lives.
Great, thanks, Judith. So Marlene asked a question earlier about sports wagering being a predictor of past and future problem gambling, and what would we recommend be done in advance of the potential and looking very likely legalization of sports wagering here in Massachusetts. So I think I'd like to open that up to everybody. We have just under 10 minutes left for our panel discussion, and Judith, you may not be aware, but certainly Mark, Marlene, and Victor are aware that sports betting is very much on the horizon here in Massachusetts. And so we've been doing a lot of thinking about it, and I'd like to hear your thoughts. So I'm going to go in order again. Mark, you're up first. And unmute. Yes, thank you.
There we go. Yeah, it appears that it is imminent and on the horizon. I think I think whenever you introduce a new form of gambling, let's just say we're introducing a new form of gambling, and 7 years ago it was casinos in Massachusetts, and now we're talking about introducing sports wagering. Each certainly has their own individual characteristics that we need to pay really close attention to, including, who are the most vulnerable or at risk of developing some type of gambling related harm. I think, the sooner that we can get out the gates and provide education and information that begins to educate, specifically those groups, but also sort of the general population about, sports wagering, the risks of sports wagering, how to support, positive play, including the gambling literacy piece of it that I mentioned earlier too. Probably the better off we will be. So again, I think we should, and when I say we, I think are the three of us, sorry, not Judith, but Marlene, Victor, and myself, begin to really think about, how do we kind of lay a groundwork that provides information and look at prevention of harm down the road.
Okay, Victor, how about your thoughts?
So I'm going to refrain from speaking about any pending legislation because we don't want to put the cart before the horse here, although I know that there are a lot of concerns and rightfully so. But what I can say is I can speak directly to the programs that we lead at this moment. Our Office of Problem Gambling Services has over 23 initiatives that we currently lead across the spectrum from prevention, intervention, treatment, and recovery. And I believe that our programs will continue to enhance, develop, and grow as we think critically about mitigating harm. So I believe that we're in a very great position to continue to lead that work, because the one thing that we understand in all of our work is that this is not just simply about casino gambling. Right now, currently, as we speak, there's underground gambling that is some were rated at 4 times higher than legalized gambling. So we need to, so when we think about the people that we serve and promoting equity, we understand critically that people are engaging in all forms of different types of gambling, and specifically underground gambling. So our work was always designed to really think about the mitigation aspect from the community perspective, from leading with equity, and thinking about all these forms of gambling. So whatever the future brings, we'll be ready to address what may come.
Thank you, Victor. Marlene?
So a couple of things on this. One is that, we recently conducted, Mark referenced this earlier, but the Mass Council worked with Dr. Richard Wood around conducting the positive play study. And two major groups came out that totally connect, obviously, and that's the good news with the findings of MAGIC. One was gambling involvement, 2 or more forms of gambling definitely was problematic. And the second really challenging group that was not demonstrating positive play indicators were young men. And young men, we'll just leave it at young men, but that's, at least the male part of it is consistent with the research here. And then add sports gambling on top of it, that's of concern. I will also say, just as it relates to the work that we're doing, we're concerned about sports wagering and how that connects with video gaming as well, especially as you're thinking about young men. So what that means for me is that a couple of things. I mean, with my advocacy hat on, we're spending a lot of time working with the legislature to say, okay, there's all these different bills out there going to be included to make sure we are utilizing the best science we have and the best evaluative data we have from across the world, where other jurisdictions have gone online and or conducted sports and sports books in brick and mortar, and try to include those and advocate for that to be included in legislation. So that's part A. And then part B is to just think about what is some of the messaging, again, just go back to that technology comment I made earlier, that we can start engaging. How do we engage with these folks online? What are some of the messaging we can give? I mean, I love Judith's point, and it's, we adore our Canadian friends and colleagues because they're always willing to think about these things outside of the box. So when we think about incentivizing, I don't typically think of young males who are aggressive in their gambling being the ones who are going to talk to GameSense, maybe even online, although I think they're more likely to do that. But what can we offer? How can we incentivize that? Where are they taking in media, and how do we address these issues there? And I think this really, I agree with Mark, it's going to be Mark and Victor and myself, but it's really also has to be the operators. We have to get the operators on board to deal with some of this. So, I posed the question because I'd love for someone to just tell us what to do, but I don't know that the answer is out there. And I think this is going to be, as I think Victor said, like, if it happens, we're going to jump in and we're going to start figuring out what are the assets we currently have that are going to work. And then we're going to figure out some additional assets as we move along. So, Mark Chekowitz said, they're concerned. And I agree. I'm always concerned when new forms of gambling come. I will say online affords us so much more of an opportunity to connect with people regularly, not when it advances to problematic play, but way in the beginning and incrementally, and people can set some of that. So one of the things that the Gaming Commission has pushed forward and GameSense certainly looks to is informed decision-making. So if I have the ability to look at my personal dashboard and see how much money I'm spending minute to minute, hour by hour, if I can see some of my trends, I can see in real time what my money is. Those are things that currently we just can't give access. We can't give people access to those type of tools and information right now with the other forms of gambling. So it's problematic in some ways, and other ways I think they'll be able to learn a lot more and engage their gambling behavior in a much more accurate way.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point is, in these very technological environments, you actually have more opportunities to provide good messaging and directed and targeted messaging than you have sometimes in the brick and mortar. Judith, I'd like to just put you on the spot a little bit and ask you from an international perspective, what kinds of advice would you have for Massachusetts as we consider sports betting legalization here?
So first of all, I suspect that it's inevitable. Even Canada, long a stronghold where our criminal code forbade single event betting on the grounds that it would corrupt sport, has sort of shifted, and I think it's imminent here in Canada that we will, for the first time in our history, have legal single event sports betting. Victor alluded to the large underground market of sports betting. I did a small project back in 2007 or 6 about sports betting in a small Ontario community. And it was an interesting, fascinating network of kind of underground sports betting. So assuming inevitability, I think that a lot of what you learned in the study that was just presented will be relevant. 2 things in particular. You in Massachusetts have focused on financial harm in terms of your Play My Way and your focus on limit setting. Marlene, you alluded to some specific things around helping people set budgets and communicating to them what their spending is looking like. I think the 2 things that we should probably think about in terms of sports betting, the things we can do, are to tackle financial harm, providing tools, as Marlene said, tools that help them to self-monitor and tools that help them to self-limit. So you want to increase self-awareness, you want to encourage self-monitoring or self-control. And so the kinds of tools that you have in place and the ones Marlene alluded to would help converge on the issue of financial harm. The other one that I think is going to be really interesting with sports betting is to take your recommendation around gambling fallacies, because I suspect, although I haven't seen research specifically looking at it, that fallacies are perhaps more pernicious in forms of gambling where there is an element of skill. And we know there is an element of skill in certain forms of gambling. Having some knowledge of the leagues and the teams and the players' injuries, of course, plays a small role. So what we really need people to understand is what is the relative contribution of all the knowledge and skill you have versus the house advantage and the randomness of sports betting. So I think you have a really great, almost unique education campaign around gambling fallacies that you can undertake, and definitely continue your kind of statewide emphasis on tackling financial harm.
Great. Thank you, Judith. So Jessica Collins from the Public Health Institute of Western Mass poses a question for the panel. And I think for the research team as well. She asks, are any of the policies that were recommended in the finding slides in place now? Is there opportunity to review and potentially implement if they are not in place? So let's go to the top with Mark.
I would need to take a really close look at the finding slides. I do believe that there are certain ways in which we have a foundation, and in certain ways we have already begun to implement those recommendations. The way that we promote informed decision making, the way that we're looking at positive play, the way that we're looking at how we make sure that tools and resources are available for persons who are experiencing gambling related harm. Whether it's voluntary self-exclusion program or whether it's connecting people with help, there are ways in which we're doing it. As with any study of this magnitude, there's ways that we could do it better or differently, and that's what's exciting. And so, to Jessica's question, yeah, we can respond to this. I don't know if we'll be able to respond to every single piece of it, but much like we have over the past several years, we kind of make these incremental changes, kind of chipping away at the issue, taking in evidence as we have it, making changes, and looking at how we can kind of craft the programs and services that are available.
Great. Victor?
So thank you, Jessica, for that question. And what I can add to that is my concern is the following. The recommendations, our collective goal, let me just say, by legislation and our collective goal is to mitigate harms associated with gambling. That is our collective goal. And with the recommendations, what I would just suggest to the research team is that we think about embracing the specifically around policies relating to prevention, that we embrace the definition of SAMHSA as we think about prevention. And that definition, it has 2 parts. The first part is about changing environmental conditions. And the second part is about personal attributes. And I think that that changing environmental condition, again, is what I mentioned earlier about that is, as we commonly identify in public health as a social determinant. And that is responsible for 95% of health outcomes. And what I'm concerned about is that these recommendations are too narrow and too individually focused. And so getting back to Jessica's point, I think that there are some things within the recommendations, and I concur with Mark to say, yes, there are some things that is currently happening. There's some things that we can do better. But ultimately, our ultimate goal is to mitigate harm. And I think that there's an opportunity here to look and revisit some of these recommendations and really put a more broader public health component to it. And the last component is, I will continue to reiterate this, is that we must think critically about equity. If we have to, if our collective goal is to mitigate harm, and we understand that people of color are disproportionately impacted by gambling, then we must think about these recommendations through a broader context in that sort of environmental conditions, and think critically about promoting equity as a way that we can arrive to a point of working together to mitigate the harms.
Thanks, Victor. Marlene, do you have anything you want to add to the discussion?
No, I mean, I think they've covered it. I think, you know, Mark said there's room for improvement. I think there's you know, dramatic changes that could happen to better meet the needs of the people struggling with gambling in the Commonwealth.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for our panelists and for our audience as well to understand that what we were doing in trying to sort of craft these recommendations was we were trying to take directly from the research results, from what we found with the cohort, and think about how that might you know, translate into an action step. And so it's very important for us as the research team, in my opinion, to listen to what people like Mark and Victor and Marlene are saying, but we also would be very interested to hear from members of our audience. Once you have sort of reviewed the slides, or, you know, after you've given some thought to the presentation today, if you think that there are recommendations that that flow directly from the results, but could be added, or recommendations that you think could be different, we very much want to hear from you as we move into the last step of producing the report, which is to produce the final report itself. So
Can I say one thing related to that? I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to say, you had someone in the chat earlier, I forget the name, but who mentioned, this individual mentioned that they were concerned that people are screening, but they don't know anything about gambling problems, and they don't know anything about treatment of gambling problems. And I think that's really key. Like, how do we get, like, we can have this full spectrum, but if you're screening and you don't know what to do with this information, and I've trained a lot of clinicians in the last 2 decades who are nervous about this concern, I think that's really important to pay attention to. So to your point, Rachel, you've put this information out there, but it's good to hear from folks about how do they, you know, what's the day-to-day implications of this? And if that's it, like they're screening, but they don't know what to do with it, that's of some concern. That's really important information. I'm sure Victor wants to hear, but, you know, for all of us to consider, how do we better prepare people for this topic and this engagement with people who most need the help?
yeah, I mean, it is a real concern because, you know, like many other people in society, having conversations about money and about financial issues can be very uncomfortable, both for the, you know, for the treatment person, the treatment professional, but also for the, you know, for the person who's there seeking help, whether it's for a gambling problem or some other kind of problem. You know, it can be very difficult to sort of know what to do with information. And I guess I would sort of throw this over to Rob for a minute with his experience as a clinical psychologist, and ask if there are sort of ideas that you have, Rob, about how clinicians could be helped to be more comfortable with asking those kinds of questions and educated about where to link people up with help.
Well, it's really a matter of just making an automated part of the screening process, in my experience. When I worked at mental health clinics and substance use clinics, you have an intake form. And truth is that a lot of different agencies are advocating for their own questions to be added to this form. So they have to be very simple, easy questions. But as Marlene's pointed out, the answers to those questions have to lead to an outcome. You can't simply collect information. In fact, probably doing more harm than good by screening for problem gambling and then not doing anything about it. People alert you to it, and then you've dropped the ball. So my experience, I mean, you don't have to verbally ask. It's really part of the intake screening. And, but then having some protocols in place with your agency so someone scores, at risk for gambling here, what is our protocol? It's got to be it's got a very, very operationalized protocol. What do you do about that? So you just make it part of the routine.
Right. Judith,
Rachel,
I see you have your hand up.
Can I answer that when you get a chance, Rachel, on the treatment aspect?
let me give Judith a chance, and then we'll come back to you, Victor.
Okay, well, I was just thinking that in terms of the last set of recommendations you drew from previous research, and the one regarding the proximity of ATMs to the gaming floor is one that I think we're seeing is increasingly outdated in terms of the myriad of ways that players can access funds to gamble and the myriad of ways they can gamble. So I think we need a bigger strategy around financial harm than just where the ATMs are located. And this is where we get to another theme, which is, to some extent, we can ask operators of casinos to do certain things, but the kind of regulatory leadership that you've provided in Massachusetts is actually better, because you're not asking individual operators to step out ahead of the competition in this kind of social responsibility space. You're rather setting standards that level the playing field. And so if we think about financial harm, I think we should think about regulatory leadership, but I think this is also an example of where we need to broaden the number of stakeholders involved. So it's one thing to understand in a clinical intake interview, whether or not someone's experiencing problems with the amount of money they're spending on gambling. But I think there's a whole strategy of working with the financial sector to help equip people with better tools for managing any financial harm they might experience from gambling. You know that banks have budgeting tools that tell you how much you're spending on different things each month. Could you set thresholds for how much you're going to spend on gambling? Could you have, stop approving transactions for gambling for the rest of the month? Could you, things like that. This is building on tools that banks already have. Could you also step up protections for joint account holders so that financial harm, I mean, the biggest concern with financial harm is not that it's limited to the gambler, but that it extends to sometimes their immediate family and dependents, but sometimes even multi-generational. And so if we really want to tackle that, let's think about the kinds of tools we need to put in the hands of significant others to help themselves. And much of that happens not through putting additional requirements on gambling operators, but engaging additional stakeholders in the fight to reduce gambling harm. And this is something, Victor, I know that you've put a lot of emphasis on, is who else can we involve in this effort to reduce financial harm? And I would just say that the financial sector, given where we're going with how players access money, becomes a very important player in that fight.
Great, thank you, Judith. Victor, you have the last word, because then we have to go to our closing.
So let me I want to add to the point that Marlene raised, and I share her concerns. I think it's right on time when we are want to make sure that providers and individuals who are engaging individuals who have experiencing distress around gambling have the right capacity, tools, resources, and knowledge about how to engage, both treat and refer individuals with problem gambling. And to that end, one of the other aspects that we launched on July 1st is a brand new technical assistance center that's specific around treatment. And as part of that, as an outcome of that, we'll now have 6 dedicated individuals in each of the regions who will be working with each of the treatment facilities and other facilities and other jurisdictions that will do comprehensive capacity building, because we want to make sure that folks have the tools, the resources, the knowledge, and the capacity. The other thing I would say is that because of this capacity issue, one of the other projects that we have is Project Build Up, which this is a project that we've had now in 2 years that provides grants to organizations who are doing clinical services that will give them direct grants so that they can build their capacity around treating and engaging and treating and referring people with gambling disorders. We've made those investments and we'll continue to make those investments to ensure that folks not only have knowledge, but also have the tools necessary to engage and treat and refer individuals with gambling disorders.
Great. Thank you, Victor. And thank you all of the members of the panel. We are now down to the last few minutes of this exciting webinar. And I'm going to ask Kathy Judstein to take us out. Kathy?
Hi, thank you, Rachel. This has been a great morning. On behalf of my fellow commissioners, I do wish to thank you formally, Dr. Wahlberg and Dr. Williams, for this comprehensive report, and to the engaged panel of experts. Massachusetts Gaming Commission has long recognized the legislature's wisdom and foresight to mandate groundbreaking research to inform programming and treatment to mitigate the social and economic impacts of gambling here in Massachusetts. And how fitting that today's presentation falls on the last day of March, Problem Gambling Awareness Month. Promoting safe levels of play and reducing gambling-related harm are pivotal pieces of the Commission's work, especially as we in Massachusetts continue to grapple with the effects of the pandemic. The research presented today is unique. There have been no other longitudinal study of gambling behavior of this scale in the United States. I understand it shapes our understanding of gambling behavior in Massachusetts and contributes to the few comparable studies worldwide. I want to thank the research team and the research review panel for ensuring the independence of the study, its findings and recommendations. And moving forward, the Massachusetts Gaming Commission will appreciate the characterization of this research as guidance and not immediate direction, more like a compass than a map. As you've heard Director Vanderlinden say, we'll affirmatively use this information as we review our regulations, their impact, and the responsible gaming framework. So a couple key takeaways for me from this morning's discussion, and again, thank you, it's just riveting. The findings and recommendations lend clear support for certain MGC initiatives, such as GameSense and Play My Way, as well as regulations like the prohibition of ATMs on the gaming floor. I wish to thank my predecessor, Steve Crosby, who I know is here today, for working with the early commission to make sure those initiatives were in play. Number 2, the stability of recreation gamblers supports our current positive play initiative. Mark, you have emphasized that today and will continue to do that good work. As to economic impact, thought an interesting takeaway was that the decrease found in out-of-state gambling was commensurate with the opening of casinos in the Commonwealth, supporting the legislature's goal for repatriation of Massachusetts dollars. Number 4, advertising matters. Gambling or gaming literacy matters. Number 5, we need, Marlene, you pointed this out, continued innovation for use of our data that we gather from the casino licensees. Number 6, the MGC must remain vigilant as to minors and underage individuals on the gaming floor and will continue to enforce findings of non-compliance. And number 7, while there are so many impressions that I could highlight, I'll just end with this particular impression, this note, as to my takeaways. While the study doesn't address the issue directly, the MGC is certainly committed to understanding the relevant social determinants of problem gambling. And most importantly, under our recently adopted statement of purpose on equity and inclusion, we will intentionally focus on the impact of expanded gaming and our work on communities of color, including the Black, Latinx, and the AAPI communities. As Victor emphasized, equity matters. And finally, this report really highlights the importance of the MGC's collaboration with DPH. Thank you to Director Vanderlinden and Director Ortiz for their leadership in this partnership. We've learned today that there is no silver bullet to prevent problem gaming. And our work and that of DPH intersect at critical junctures, positioning our two agencies well to offer the wide array of education and policy programming that Professor Williams emphasized, needed for a comprehensive public health response to problem gambling that focuses on community, integrates high risk factors such as substance abuse and mental health, and utilizes multifaceted educational tools and approaches, including media campaigns, community clinics, expanded linguistic resources, and school-based programs. And that work will happen in concert and partnership with all of our key stakeholders across the Commonwealth, including Marlene Werner, the Mass Council on Gaming and Health, and the inspired work of our Game Sense advisors, and with the Massachusetts State Lottery. Thank you again to the entire research team for today's presentation. I look forward to the release of the final report. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So in closing, I want to thank everyone for attending. I will confess to being quite intimidated by the size of our audience, but I guess we probably could not have gotten this level of attendance without the pandemic. So I guess I'll be grateful for that. In addition to responding to your questions, our team will be reaching out soon to gather feedback about the webinar. So please don't let our emails go to your junk folder. I want to say thank you again. This has been a tremendous event and so exciting to have so many of you with us. Thank you and have a wonderful